It was the month of June, and the weather was beautiful. Stuart left school. He was on holiday, but he was not happy. He did not have a motorbike. Stuart was 17 years old. He left school, but he did not start work. All his mates started work immediately, but Stuart did not want to work. He wanted a long holiday, and he needed a motorbike. Stuart lived in Leeds, a big city in the north of England. Leeds is a busy city, full of offices, shops and factories. It's not a good place for a holiday. Martin, a friend of Stuart's, worked in a garage. Martin had a bike for sale. It was a beauty, a Japanese Suzuki. Martin wanted £350 for the bike, but Stuart did not have £350. He didn't have any money. Stuart went and looked at the bike every day. It was a beauty. He wanted to buy it. Where can I find £350? Stuart asked himself. Stuart left the garage and walked back home. His house was in Blenheim Street, near the university. There were lots of old, empty houses in Blenheim Street. The university was one of the biggest in England. The university often bought land and buildings. Most of the old houses in Blenheim Street belonged to the university. Some of these houses had been empty for years. Stuart often searched through them. Sometimes he found old books and gramophone records. One day, he told himself, I'll find something valuable. There was a large house at the corner of Blenheim Street. Its owner, a rich old woman, had died a few days ago. The university bought the house immediately. Now the house was empty. There was wood across the front door, and the windows were broken. Someone looked out of a window. It was a man of about 20. He had long hair and was wearing a headband. He looked strange. He was a squatter. Squatters live in old, empty houses, and they don't pay any rent. The stranger waved to Stuart. He wanted to speak to Stuart. What does he want? Stuart asked himself. Hi. Hello. Like to help me? Okay. Watch this house. How long? Half an hour. Okay. I'm Stuart. My name's Frank. I'll go and get my things. Are you going to squat here, Frank? Yes. Don't let anyone else in. I'll be back soon. Okay. See you. Frank walked off slowly down the street. His head was bent forward, and he was looking down at the pavement. He was about 20, but he looked much older. Frank went round the corner, and Stuart turned towards the house. It looked interesting. The window was low, quite near the ground. The street was empty. Stuart put one leg over the windowsill and looked inside. Outside, the sun was shining brightly. Inside the house, it was dark. Stuart stood for a few moments and waited. Slowly, the inside of the room became clearer. There was a calendar on the wall. Lots of old newspapers were lying around on the floor. There was a mattress against the far wall. It looked new. Stuart looked up and down the street. There was no one around. He quickly climbed into the room. Stuart walked to the middle of the room and kicked away the old newspapers. There was nothing underneath them. There was no carpet, and the floorboards were covered with dirt. Stuart took the calendar down from the wall. It was an old one, 5 years old. No one had changed it for 5 years. Then Stuart remembered. The owner of the house, the old woman, had been ill for a long time. She hadn't got out of her bed for 5 years. The mattress was leaning against the far wall. Stuart went over and looked at it carefully. It was a good mattress. Stuart picked up the mattress and turned it over carefully. There was some stitching along one side, about 10 centimetres long. Stuart held the mattress between his knees and took out a small knife. Stuart cut the stitches carefully and then put his hand in the hole. He felt a bundle of newspapers and pulled it out. He quickly unwrapped it. Inside the bundle of newspapers, there were some banknotes. Suddenly, Stuart heard a voice. It was Frank.
"Hey! Stuart! Where are you?"
Frank was shouting. Stuart quickly wrapped up the money inside the newspapers. He held the bundle behind his back.
"I'm in here, Frank!"
he shouted. Frank came up to the window and looked into the room.
"What are you doing in there?"
Frank asked.
"Nothing," replied Stuart. "I'm looking around."
Frank climbed into the room and came closer to Stuart. Stuart moved to the wall. He held the bundle of newspapers behind his back. Frank looked round the room. He didn't see Stuart's knife on the floor.
"You haven't taken anything, have you?" asked Frank.
"I haven't taken anything of yours," replied Stuart.
"You've moved this mattress,"
said Frank. Frank picked up the mattress and turned it over carefully. Then he saw the hole in the side.
"You cut this mattress?"
"It was stitched."
"Is this your knife?"
"Yes."
"What were you doing?"
"Nothing."
"You found something."
"I didn't."
"What's that in your hand?"
"Where?"
"Behind your back."
"Nothing."
"You got something."
"Some old newspapers."
"Hand them over." "They're mine."
Stuart remembered the motorbike. He needed the money. He was going to keep it. It was his money, not Frank's. Frank was holding Stuart's knife in his hand. He came nearer to Stuart.
"Give me those newspapers,"
he said again. Stuart had an idea.
"There's something else in the mattress," he said to Frank. "There was something under the newspapers. It's still there."
Frank looked at Stuart for a few moments. He didn't believe him at first.
"Look and see,"
said Stuart. Frank put the knife down on the floor. He picked up the mattress and put his hand deep in the hole. Stuart did not wait for a moment. He turned and jumped out through the window into the street. He ran quickly. There was a turning on the right. Stuart ran round the corner. He heard a shout behind him. It was Frank. Round the corner, there was another old empty house. It had a large garden on one side. Thick bushes had grown all over the garden. Stuart jumped over the low wall. He ran for a few meters and then hid under some bushes. Stuart heard more shouting and footsteps. The footsteps became louder, then they stopped. Stuart waited silently. He did not breathe. Then the footsteps started once again. Stuart laughed quietly to himself. Frank had quickly picked up Stuart's knife. He jumped out of the window after him. Frank saw Stuart. He was running round the corner. Frank ran after him and turned the corner, but the street was empty. Frank stopped for a few moments and looked around. He noticed the old garden.
"Perhaps he's in there,"
thought Frank. But everything in the garden was quiet. Frank saw nothing. There was another corner farther down the street. Frank started running again. He was still holding Stuart's knife. Stuart was happy. He had escaped from Frank with the money. Stuart sat up under the bushes and opened out the newspapers. The banknotes were wrapped tightly together. Stuart unwrapped them and counted them carefully. 10, 20, 30, 320, 325. Stuart had found £325, and Martin wanted £350 for his motorbike. It was cool in the garden, and Stuart lay back under the bushes. "I'll wait here for half an hour," thought Stuart. "Then I'll go to Martin." It was now nearly 12 o'clock. The day was getting much hotter. A police car was parked in a side street. There were 2 policemen in the car. The sergeant, a fat, round-faced man, was half asleep. The other policeman was younger and taller. He was a constable. Suddenly, the constable sat up. He had seen something strange. "Wake up, Sergeant!" he shouted. "Look over there!" "Where? What?" asked the sergeant, still half asleep. "Over there! Someone's running with a knife," replied the constable. "The man's gone mad. It's this heat." "Quick, get out and catch him," said the sergeant. The 2 policemen jumped out of their car. Frank saw the policeman. He threw Stuart's knife away and started to run. The constable soon caught him and held his arm tightly. The sergeant found the knife in some long grass. The constable took Frank towards the police car. The sergeant came up to them. He was holding the knife. "Oh, it's you," the sergeant said to Frank. "What's going on, Frank?" "I'm looking for a guy." "With a knife?" "What guy?" "He's stolen my money." "What money?" "How much money?" "I don't know. A lot." "You don't know?" "Where did you get it?" "In an old house." "Come on, into the car." "Where are you taking me?" asked Frank. "To the police station," replied the constable. "But I haven't done anything. The money was mine. That guy took it. What's his name? Stuart. Stuart took it." "Who's Stuart?" asked the constable. "I met him in an old house," replied Frank. "Where you found the money?" asked the sergeant. "Yes, I found it inside a mattress," said Frank. "Who's got the money now?" asked the sergeant. "That guy, Stuart. He ran away with it." "So, now we have to find Stuart," said the constable. Stuart waited in the garden for half an hour. It was getting hotter. It was nearly 12 o'clock. "I'll have to move now," thought Stuart. "Martin goes for his lunch at 12:30. Stuart looked out carefully from the bushes. The garden was empty. He hurried out of the garden onto the street. He walked towards Martin's garage. Stuart did not see the police car. It stopped outside the garden a few moments later. "Look in this garden," Frank told the policeman. "Perhaps he's hiding in here." "Hi, Martin." "Hello, Stuart." "How much for the bike?" £350. "I want it." "How much for me?" "Still £350. "Have you any money?" "Yes." "How much?" £300. No, that's not enough. 325? Okay, she's yours. Great, thanks. The policeman got out of the car. Frank got out too. The constable held his arm tightly. The sergeant went into the garden. He looked around for some time. Then he came back. He was holding a bundle of newspapers.
There's no one there, the sergeant said, but I found these old newspapers.
That's them, shouted Frank. Something was wrapped in those newspapers. Just then a motorbike drove up towards the police car. That's him, shouted Frank excitedly. That's the guy. He's bought a motorbike with my money. Stop, the sergeant called to Stuart. Stop. Stuart did not see Frank. What do the police want? Stuart asked himself. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm driving correctly. Stuart stopped the bike by the side of the road. He took off his helmet. Is that bike yours? The sergeant asked him. Yes, it's mine, replied Stuart. I bought it at the garage down the road. Then Stuart saw Frank. What have you told these cops? Stuart shouted angrily at Frank. We'll all go to this garage, said the sergeant. They all walked back to Martin's garage. A big, black cloud now covered the sun. It was beginning to rain. So, this lad paid you £325 for this bike, the sergeant said to Martin. Martin agreed. And where did you get this money? The sergeant asked Stuart. I found it, replied Stuart. I found it in a mattress. It was in an empty house. The sergeant took the money from Martin. We'll look after this money, he said. You two can go now. It's my money, shouted Frank. Do you want to come to the police station with us? Asked the constable. Frank walked away, still shouting. I'm sorry, Martin said to Stuart. It's my bike again. Not for long, replied Stuart. What do you mean? Asked the sergeant. It has started to rain now, replied Stuart. I don't want a holiday. I'm going to get a job. I'm going to save another £325 and buy that bike.
There was forest all round for hundreds of kilometres, and there were no roads in the forest. There were only tracks. 2 tents stood in a clearing. 2 men were standing near the tents. The younger man, Manuel, was making coffee on a small stove. He looked up at the sky. It's going to rain today, he said. I know, replied Leon. And the rain will turn the ground into mud. Then we'll never get back to base. 4 men were working in the forest. They were looking for iron and other metals. Leon was the boss, and he was angry. It was early morning. Leon and Manuel were ready to leave, but Joe and Pedro were out in the forest. They left in the truck 2 days ago, said Leon. They're very late. Joe was always making trouble. He was younger than Leon, and he was clever. He wanted to be boss. Manuel poured the coffee into mugs, and the 2 men drank it slowly. Suddenly, they heard the sound of a truck. They're back, said Manuel. The truck came up the rough track. It stopped near the tents. Joe jumped out. He was a big man with red hair. He was smiling. His smile made Leon more angry. You're late, said Leon. Where have you been? Hunting, replied Joe, and he held up his rifle. Hunting? Leon shouted angrily. That's not your job. We haven't time for hunting. We were away for 2 days, replied Joe. We're not very late. I'm the boss here, Leon shouted. Joe looked at Leon angrily. He was not smiling now. We're late, very late, said Leon. The rain will start soon, and then there will be mud everywhere. We must leave now. Manuel took down the tents, and Joe and Pedro put the boxes into the truck. Hurry, shouted Leon. It's 10 o'clock. Let's go." Soon, everything was in the truck. Joe sat in the driver's seat. Leon sat beside him. Manuel and Pedro climbed into the back of the truck. Joe started the engine, and the journey began. They drove easily for the first 20 kilometers. Then they came to a stream. "There was no water here last week," Pedro shouted to Manuel. "Look at the water now!" The stream was full of water. Joe slowed down and drove the truck carefully through the rushing water. They crossed the stream, and Joe drove faster. The rain was now falling heavily. The track was very muddy, and the truck began to slide. "Watch out!" shouted Leon. But it was too late. The truck stopped. The wheels were still turning, but the truck was not moving. The wheels were turning round and round in the mud. Leon got out, and Pedro and Manuel jumped down. Joe sat in the driver's seat. Leon looked at the wheels in the mud. Then he looked up at Joe. "It's your fault," he said angrily. "You were driving too fast." "Pedro, you cut branches from those trees," ordered Leon. "And you, Manuel, throw the branches under the wheels." Pedro got a large knife out of the truck, and Manuel helped him. Leon turned to Joe. "You, come and help us." Joe did not move. "I'm driving the truck," he said. "That's my job." "I'm boss here," shouted Leon. "Come and help us." Joe did not say anything. He did not get out of the truck. Leon looked at him angrily. Then Leon walked away. Manuel and Pedro threw branches under the wheels. "Okay, that's enough," said Leon. "Let's go." Joe started the engine again. Pedro and Manuel pushed the back of the truck. The wheels turned, and the engine roared. But the truck did not move. "Push harder!" shouted Leon. Suddenly, the truck moved forward. It was out of the mud. Pedro and Manuel shouted happily. At that moment, a large branch flew up from under a wheel. It hit Leon's arm. He stepped back and fell in the mud. "Stop the truck!" shouted Manuel. "Leon's hurt!" At midday, it was still raining heavily. The track was covered with mud. Joe drove slowly, and the truck did not stop again. They climbed up a steep hill. On the other side, the track went down to a river. It was the biggest river in the forest. This was the last river between the men and their base. An old wooden bridge crossed over the river. They drove down towards the bridge. "Look!" Leon shouted to Joe. "Something's wrong! It's the bridge! It's broken!" Joe did not stop the truck. He drove down slowly to the bank of the river. He drove to the edge of the broken bridge. Then he stopped. They all got out of the truck. They stood in silence. Nobody spoke. They looked at the broken bridge and at the rushing water. Pedro spoke first. "There is no way across the river now. How can we get back to base?" "We must get help," said Leon. "Pedro, you climb back up the hill. Take the radio with you and call base. Perhaps they'll hear you and send help." Manuel lifted the radio out of the truck and fixed it to Pedro's back. Joe stopped them. "It won't work," he said. "Why not?" asked Leon. "It isn't a strong radio," replied Joe. "We're too far away from the base. No one will hear us from this side of the river. We must cross the river by ourselves." "We can't," said Leon. "We must get help." "We can't get help from here," said Joe. "We must cross the river first. Then we can get help." "But how do we get across?" asked Leon. "It's too dangerous. Look at the water." The rain was still falling heavily, and the water was rising. "I have a plan," said Joe. Leon looked at Joe and smiled. "You're clever, Joe," Leon said. "You always have plans, but they never work." Let's listen to Joe's plan, said Manuel. We can use the boat, said Joe. Leon laughed. Don't be stupid. The boat's too small for 4 people. And look at the rushing water. It will carry the boat away. But we've got a rope, said Joe. We can tie the rope to the boat. With luck, the water will carry the boat to the other side. We can try it, said Pedro. It won't work, said Leon. It will work, said Joe. Look, I'll show you. It won't work, Leon said, but we can try it. I'll go first, Joe said. It's my plan. No, let me go, said Pedro. I am stronger. You can both go, said Leon. Pedro, you stay on the other side. Joe, you bring the boat back, and then you can take Manuel. Then you can come back again for me. Good, Joe said. Pedro, you bring the radio. You can use it on the other side of the river. Pedro got the rubber boat out of the truck and pumped it up. Leon helped him with his right arm. There was a long rope in the back of the truck. Joe tied it to the broken bridge. Manuel tied the other end of the rope to the rubber boat. It's a long rope, Leon said. It'll be all right. Hurry, said Joe. The water is rising quickly. Joe and Pedro carried the boat. Manuel and Leon walked behind them. Manuel held the boat. Joe and Pedro climbed in. The rushing water took the boat into the middle of the river. The boat crossed to the other side. It came near the bridge. Joe held on. Pedro climbed out of the boat. Pedro tied the rope to a piece of the bridge. Pedro stayed on the far side of the river. Joe pulled hard on the rope, and the boat slowly came back to Leon and Manuel. You get in now, Manuel, said Leon. I'm going last. No, you're not, Manuel replied. Your arm is broken. You can't get into the boat alone. You need help. I'll help you. Manuel is right, said Joe. You need help, Leon. Manuel helped Leon into the boat. He sat down in the boat, and Joe pulled hard on the rope. Trouble came suddenly. Joe and Leon were in the middle of the river. Leon saw the tree first. The rushing water was pulling it down the river. Look out! Leon shouted. Joe looked round. At that moment, the branches of the tree hit the boat. Joe held on to the rope. His feet slipped, and the boat moved away from him. Hold on to the rope! Leon shouted. But Joe did not listen. He let go of the rope and swam towards the rubber boat. Joe was a good swimmer, and he soon reached the boat. He held it tightly and kicked his legs hard in the water. The boat moved away from the tree. Good, Joe shouted to Leon. The boat's free. Leave the boat, shouted Leon. Save yourself. Joe did not listen. He held the boat and kicked his legs. A few moments later, Joe heard a loud noise. What's that? He asked Leon. It's a waterfall, replied Leon. The water will pull the boat over. Leave the boat. Save yourself. Look, shouted Joe. There's a rock in front of us. We must reach it. Don't be a fool, said Leon. Save yourself. You can't save me. The water rushed round the boat. It was pulling them towards the waterfall. Joe kicked his legs harder. The boat moved quickly towards the rock. Get ready, shouted Joe. Jump for the rock. Leon was ready. The boat came near the rock, and Leon jumped. Joe let go of the boat and swam to the rock. The two men lay on the rock. For a few minutes, they did not say anything. Then Leon turned and smiled at Joe. Joe had saved his life. We're not safe yet, Joe shouted. The rain has stopped, but the water is still rising. It'll cover the rock in an hour or two. Joe was right. There was water all round the two men. In front of them, the water dropped over the waterfall. Behind them, there was the broken bridge. "We must get help," said Leon. "But how?" "Pedro," replied Joe. "He can help us. He's got the radio." Pedro was waiting on the far side of the river. He watched Joe and Leon. They climbed onto the rock. They were safe. "They won't be safe for long," thought Pedro. "I must call base and get help." Pedro climbed up the hill behind him. He walked quickly for half an hour. At the top of the hill, he climbed onto a high rock. He took the radio off his back and pulled out the aerial. Pedro spoke into the radio. "PX-75 calling base. PX-75 calling base." He waited and listened. "PX-75 calling base. PX-75 calling base." There was no reply. "PX-75 calling base. PX-75 calling base." Philip was sitting at the control desk. He was listening to the radio. PX-75 was Leon's number. Philip turned the dials of the radio. The voice became clearer. "Hello, PX-75, said Philip. "This is base. What's your message? Over." "Hello, base. PX-75 here. Pedro speaking. Can you hear me?" "Loud and clear, Pedro. What's your message? Over." "We're in trouble," said Pedro. "The bridge over the River Sandano is broken. Joe and Leon are on a rock in the middle of the river. They are above the waterfall. Can you send help? Over. River Sandano, near bridge, above waterfall. Okay, Pedro. Help is coming. Over." Pedro climbed down the hill to the broken bridge. Manuel was waiting on the other side of the river. Pedro shouted, and Manuel waved. Both men looked down the river. The water was rising fast, and the rock looked very small now. On the rock, Joe was holding Leon in his arms. Leon's arm was covered in blood. His eyes were closed, and he did not move. Then Joe heard the noise. A helicopter. It was high above the broken bridge. "A helicopter!" Joe shouted. "Leon, look!" But Leon's eyes were closed, and he said nothing. The helicopter was soon over the rock. A rope was lowered, and Joe held it. Then he tied it round Leon. Joe held Leon with one hand, and he held the rope with the other. Slowly, the two men were lifted in the air. Leon woke up slowly. He was still half asleep. "Where am I?" he asked. Then he remembered the rock, and the helicopter, and Joe. "Joe!" he shouted out. "Where's Joe?" "Don't worry," said a voice. "I'm not dead yet." Leon opened his eyes fully and saw Joe. Joe was smiling. Pedro and Manuel were standing next to him. The four men were in a hut at base. Leon was lying in bed, and his arm was in plaster. "You'll feel better in a few days, Leon," said Joe. "I feel better now," said Leon, "but I need a drink." "Water?" asked Manuel. "No, not water," replied Leon. "I don't want to see water again, not for a long time." And they all laughed.
In the last days of December, Dr. Hall, the village priest, was working in his study, when his servant entered the room in great alarm. "Oh, Dr. Hall, sir," she cried, "what do you think? The poor Squire's dead." "What? Squire Bowles? What are you saying, woman?" replied the priest. "I saw him only yesterday." "Yes, sir, I know," said the servant, "but it's true. Mr. Wickham, the clerk, has just brought the news on his way to ring the church bell. You'll hear it yourself in a moment. Listen, there it is." And sure enough, The bell then began to ring, long and slow, telling the people of the village that someone had died. Dr. Hall stood up. "This is terrible," he said. "I must go up to the hall at once. The Squire was so much better yesterday. It seems so sudden." "Yes, sir," agreed the servant. "Mr. Wickham said that the poor Squire was taken ill very suddenly with a terrible pain. He died very quickly, and Wickham said that they want him buried quickly too." "Yes, yes. Well, I must ask Mrs. Bowles herself, or Mr. Joseph," said the priest. "Bring me my coat and hat, please. Oh, and tell Mr. Wickham that I would like to see him when he has finished ringing the bell." And he hurried off to the hall. When he returned an hour later, he found the clerk waiting for him. "There's a lot of work for you to do, Wickham," he said, "and not much time to do it." "Yes, sir," said Wickham. "You'll want the family tomb opened, of course." "No, no, not at all," replied Dr. Hall. "The poor Squire said before he died that he did not want to be buried in the family tomb. It is to be an earth grave in the churchyard." "Excuse me, sir," said Wickham, very surprised. "Do I understand you right? No tomb, you said, and just an earth grave? The poor Squire was too ill to know what he was saying, surely." "Yes, Wickham, it seems strange to me, too," said the priest. "But Mr. Joseph tells me that his father, or I should say his stepfather, made his wishes very clear when he was in good health. Clean earth and open air. You know, of course, the Squire had some strange ideas, though he never told me of this one. Oh, and there's another thing, Wickham. No coffin." Oh dear," said Wickham. "There'll be some talk about that. And I know that old Mr. Wright has some lovely wood for the Squire's coffin. He's kept it for him for years." "Well," said Dr. Hall, "those are the Squire's wishes, so I'm told, so that's what we must do. You must get the grave dug and everything ready by 10 o'clock tomorrow night. Tell Wright that we shall need some lights." "Very well, sir. If those are the orders, I must do my best," said Wickham. "Shall I send the women from the village to prepare the body?" "No, Wickham, that was not mentioned," said the priest. "No doubt Mr. Joseph will send for them if he wants them. You have enough work to do without that. Good night, Wickham." He paused. "I was just writing out the year's burials in the church records. I didn't think that I'd have to add Squire Bowles' name to them." The Squire's burial took place as planned. All the villagers and a few neighbours were present, and the Squire's stepson Joseph walked behind the body as it was carried to the churchyard. In those days nobody expected the Squire's wife to come to the burial. The Squire had no family except his wife and stepson, and he had left everything to his wife. But what was everything? The land, house, furniture, pictures, and silver were all there, but no money was found. This was very strange. Squire Bowles was quite a rich man. He received plenty of money from his land every year. His lawyers were honest, but still there was no money. The Squire had not been mean with his money. His wife had all she needed. He sent Joseph to school and university, and he lived well. But still he earned more money than he spent. Where was it? Mrs. Bowles and her son searched the house and grounds several times, but found no money. They could not understand it. They sat one evening in the library discussing the problem for the 20th time. "You've been through his papers again, Joseph, haven't you?" asked the mother. "Yes, mother, and I found nothing." "What was he writing the day before he died, do you know? And why was he always writing to Mr. Fowler in Gloucester? You know, he had some strange ideas about what happens to a person's soul when he dies. He was writing to Mr. Fowler about it, but he didn't finish the letter. Here, I'll read it to you." He fetched some papers from the Squire's writing table and began to read. "My dear friend, you will be interested to hear about my latest studies, though I am not sure how accurate they are. One writer says that for a time after death, a man's soul stays close to the places he knew during life, so close, in fact, that he can be called to speak to the living. Indeed, he must come if he is called with the right words. And these words are given in an experiment in Dr. Moore's book, which I have copied out for you. But when the soul has come and has opened its mouth to speak, the caller may see and hear more than he wishes, which is usually to know where the dead man has hidden his money. Joseph stopped reading, and there was silence for a moment. Then his mother said, "There was no more than that?" "No, mother, nothing." "And have you met this Mr. Fowler?" "Yes, he came to speak once or twice at Oxford." "Well," said the mother, "as he was a friend of the Squire, I think you should write to him and tell him what has happened. You will know what to say, and the letter is for him after all." "You're right, mother," replied Joseph. "I'll write to him at once." And he wrote that same evening. In time a letter came back from Gloucester, and with it a large packet. And there were more evening talks in the library at the Hall. At the end of one evening the mother said, "Well, if you are sure, do it tonight. Go round by the fields where no one will see you. Oh, and here's a cloth you can use." "What cloth is it, mother?" asked Joseph. "Just a cloth," was the answer. Joseph went out by the garden door, and his mother stood in the doorway thinking, with her hand over her mouth. Then she said quietly, "It was the cloth to cover his face. Oh, I wish I had not been so hurried." The night was very dark, and a strong wind blew loud over the black fields, loud enough to drown all sounds of calling or answering, if anyone did call or answer. Next morning Joseph's mother hurried to his bedroom. "Give me the cloth," she said. "The servants must not find it, and tell me, quick." Her son, sitting on the edge of the bed, with his head in his hands, looked up at her with wild, red eyes. "We have opened his mouth," he said. "Why, oh why, mother, did you leave his face uncovered?" "You know how hurried I was that day," she replied. "I had no time. But do you mean that you have seen it?" Joseph hid his face in his hands. "Yes, mother, and he said you would see it too." His mother gave an awful cry and caught hold of the bedpost. "He's angry," Joseph went on. "He was waiting for me to call him, I'm sure. I had only just finished saying the words when I heard him, like a dog growling under the earth." He jumped to his feet and walked up and down the room. "And now he's free. What can we do? I cannot meet him again. I cannot take the drink he drank and go where he is. And I'm afraid to lie here another night. Oh, why did you do it, mother? We had enough as it was." "Be quiet," said his mother through dry lips. "It was you as much as I. But why spend time talking? Listen to me. It's only 6 o'clock. Yarmouth's not far, and we've enough money to cross the sea. Things like him can't follow us over water. We'll take the night boat to Holland. You see to the horses while I pack our bags." Joseph stared at her. "What will people say here?" "You must tell the priest that we've learnt of some of the Squire's money in Amsterdam, and we must go to collect it. Go. Or if you're not brave enough to do that, lie here and wait for him again tonight." Joseph trembled and left the room. That evening, after dark, a boatman entered an inn at Yarmouth, where a man and a woman were waiting, with their bags on the floor beside them. "Are you ready, sir and madam?" he asked. "We sail in less than an hour. My other passenger is waiting by the boat. Is this all your luggage?" He picked up the bags. "Yes, we are travelling light," said Joseph. "Did you say you have other passengers for Holland?" "Just one," replied the boatman, "and he seems to travel even lighter than you." "Do you know him?" asked Mrs. Bowles. She put her hand on her son's arm, and they both paused in the doorway. "No," said the boatman. "He keeps his face hidden, but I'd know him again by his voice. He's got a strange way of speaking, like a dog growling. But you'll find that he knows you. 'Go and fetch them out,' he said to me, 'and I'll wait for them here.' and sure enough, he's coming this way now." In those days, women who poisoned their husbands were burnt to death. The records for a certain year at Norwich tell of a woman who was punished in this way, and whose son was hanged afterwards. No one had accused them of their crime, but they told the priest of their village what they had done. The name of the village must remain secret, because people say there is money still hidden there. Dr. Moore's book of experiments is now in the University Library at Cambridge, and on page 144 this is written: "This experiment has often proved true. To find out gold hidden in the ground, robbery, murder, or any other thing, go to the grave of a dead man, call his name 3 times, and say, 'I call on you to leave the darkness and to come to me this night and tell me truly where the gold lies hidden.' Then take some earth from the dead man's grave and tie it in a clean cloth and sleep with it under your right ear. And wherever you lie or sleep, that night he will come and tell you truly, waking or sleeping."